terms of the last 100 years, last 50 years, last 20 years, last 10 years, 5 years, 3 months, right? There is a shift in human evolution. There's a shift in consciousness that has taken place in terms of how we treat ourselves, how we treat one another, our expectations around workplaces and what work is supposed to be. The opportunity of this moment is to utilize all these mechanisms and mediums that, as humans, we've invented and created to connect one another, to alleviate suffering, to make our lives more comfortable and the way we operate our systems more sustainable, whether it's cost effectiveness or just at the end of the day, more ease and peace.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Anu Gupta. Anu's a sought-after expert in breaking bias and behavior change and well-being in organizations. After seeing the social and financial harms of bias to individuals and organizations and communities, Anu synthesized his very diverse backgrounds as an attorney, a research scientist, and a meditation instructor to build programs centered on advancing equity and belonging unlike any that had existed before. In this episode, Anu and I explore what bias really is and what it's costing our businesses, our society, and our economy. We talk about the difference between conscious and unconscious bias and some of the root causes of systemic racism. And we talk about some practical interventions that can measurably reduce even unconscious bias in the workplace. We also talk about the relationship between bias and belonging, along with a lot of other topics. If you enjoy this episode, and I hope that you do, please remember to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. It makes a difference. This month, Work for Humans peaked at number 48 among all business management podcasts in the US on Apple Podcasts. That's amazing, especially when you consider how many other podcasts there are competing for the top slots. And it's thanks to people like you subscribing and sharing, so thank you. Without further ado, my conversation with Anu Gupta. Anu Gupta, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thank you for having me. I'm so thrilled and delighted to be here.
So I'm very excited to talk to you today for a lot of reasons. One of them is I think your team and you are tackling the question of bias a lot the way my team would tackle it, which is by really understanding the problem and then digging into what are the root causes. And I think you've dug deeply and subtly into what those root causes are. And I have a lot to learn in this space. So this is one of these cases where I'm going to be, every question I ask is a real question because I have a lot to learn. So the first question is, what's being lost in our society and in our economy and in our businesses because of bias? And so another way to say that same question is, if I'm a leader in my company, why should I care?
Well, thank you so much for posing that question. I never actually set out to become a bias breaker or someone who cared about bias, but it just kind of found me. And, like you, I'm a very methodical person. I was trained as a scientist and a lawyer. So, there's a way for me to really think about, well, what is the cause of this? What is the cause of this? Curiosity really led me down this path. And I started noticing that for the last 50 or so years, we spent billions and billions of dollars, billions and billions of hours trying to address this challenge of bias, of inequity, of diversity, inclusion within companies. But we're not really making any headway. What's going on? What is the challenge there? And for me, what I realized is that the work of addressing bias is one of behavior change of individuals, of teams, of organizations. And what's happening is that, as you asked, the biggest challenge around bias is that it's incredibly, incredibly expensive. It's incredibly expensive to our economy. The Kellogg Foundation found that number to be over $2 trillion annually to the US economy alone. And when it came to gender bias, over $6 trillion for all of the OECD economies. This was like about 10 years ago. So that number is probably a lot higher. So what we're losing because of bias is just an incredible amount of potential, human potential, creative potential, to actually address some of the challenges that we face as a humanity, as a global society: climate change, extinction of species, vaccines for diseases, and just making our lives easier. How does it trickle down to specific organizations and businesses? Well, we'll say in healthcare, for example, we know that bias within delivery of care costs the economy I think, $300 billion annually, something crazy like this. Same thing with policing, with education, with technology. And it's those micro decisions that are being made within teams, within that clinical care encounter, that then aggregates into these excessive costs. So, why should a company care about it? Well, a lot of these challenges around conflict within the workplace, inability to collaborate across different recruitment, retention, a lot of that really goes down to bias. And when we're talking about bias, we're not talking about conscious bias. We're not saying that, hey, I think, you are lesser than or more than because you're XYZ. It's really implicit bias or unconscious bias that we're really talking about. And this is not anyone's fault. This is more of the training of our mind. It's the software in our brains. But the exciting thing is our hardware is the same across racial diversity, gender diversity, sexual orientation, religious, political beliefs, because we're human beings. We're 99% exactly the same species. But the software is where we could do some upgrading. And that's basically my mission, to really support organizations, really unleash their full human potential, but also to save on wasted costs around discrimination lawsuits, around, so many other things that I can just talk about. And there's rampant examples across industries.
And what I'd like to do is I'd like to track your story a little bit. And I know that you began your career in law. And which branch and what was your experience of bias in the legal system? What did you see there?
Absolutely. So actually, I began my career as a teacher. I was a middle school teacher in South Korea right after college. And, I grew up in New York, so went abroad to do that. And through that, really got interested in doing international development work. So it took me to Myanmar, where I was working on issues of women's rights and ethnic reconciliation. It took me to getting a master's in international development. And that circuitous route brought me to law school, again, wanting to do kind of systems work at the World Bank or the IMF, using kind of policy as a lever to alleviate suffering on the ground across the world. But it was in law school, particularly in the US, I realized that, despite changing a lot of policies and practices, some of the procedural things, the results weren't changing. The inequity wasn't changing. And for me, this really came to a head. My first summer, I was working in New Orleans and I was in a sentencing court, and just observing the judge, give 2, 3, 4 years of sentences to basically young Black teenagers for incredibly petty crimes. Things like breaking cell phones or very, very low level possession of marijuana. Now, mind you, I'm at a really prestigious law school in New York, and basically a lot of my classmates are doing really hard drugs all the time. And they're basically being lauded and praised. So for me, that's where I began to see that, wow, what's going on in our society? And also, why such cruelty? So that what really began the inquiry. Why such cruelty? And that discovery led me to bias.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you raised the idea of micro decisions, and one of the things about the legal system is that it's kind of a gamification of the whole of society. And what I mean by that is it's a microcosm. The decisions are plain, so it sort of has a scoring system. There's winners and losers, and it's like an experimental organism. It's a place where you can see bias in action. And we talked about this before the show, but I started off out of college as a criminal defense investigator. There was one case that really hinged on identification. And a lot of times there's cross-racial challenges with cross-racial identification. Well, the judge made a mistake and thought that the translator in a particular case was the client, was the defendant. And that's because the translator and the defendant looked enough the same to the judge. It almost resulted in a mistrial. And so it's like a perfect example. It was completely unconscious, that mistake. But this was the judge. And then you've got the whole jury that have the ability to make the same kind of mistake. What is transitional justice?
Yeah, transitional justice. I mean, this is actually a really poignant example you gave, and that is an example of implicit bias. I hope we'll get to define implicit bias for our listeners. But transitional justice is really what our hope is. That's kind of the goal for our country in the US, but also as a global society for all of us. And this is an idea that really came out of the Nuremberg trials in Europe after World War II. So, of course, Europe, after coming out of World War II, had experienced such radical evil, right? There's no better way to describe what happened with the Holocaust. Basically, ethnic cleansing of people of Jewish descent, of Roma descent, of gay people, others, right? Poles, Slavs, communists. And transitional justice was basically an attempt of these countries coming out of this era of radical evil to try to deliver justice when where no level of legal administration could actually deliver justice, given the type of wrong that has been done. So that's where the idea of transitional justice was really kind of began. And since then, it's been applied in various transitioning societies like South Africa, coming out of apartheid rule. Everyone, basically, in some way, shape, or form, everyone is culpable for harms caused. Rwanda, after the genocide there. If we were to start arresting people and punishing people, the entire country would be in prison, right? And who would deliver? Even the judges, the police officers, security guards, they've all been somehow connected and culpable to the radical evil that took place within a society. So transitional justice is basically a process that a nation, a community would go through to really move forward, to create a sense of catharsis, a sense of justice, a sense of truth and reconciliation in order to move on from the past. And with the Nuremberg trials, we've done that with the Holocaust, some forms of restitution, reparations for the descendants and those that have survived, public memorials. With the apartheid regime, it was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that literally heard testimonies of all sides that were harmed, but also of the perpetrators in exchange for amnesties. So it was a really, really intentionally designed process. And for me, I became familiar with this in law school. I took a 2-semester course with the former executive secretary of the TRC in South Africa, Paul Denzel. And we were studying various case studies from Rwanda and South Africa to East Timor, to Morocco, to Chile, after Pinochet. And I was like, wait, this is what we need here in the US. This is what we need in Canada. This is what we need in Australia. Because we are transitioning as a society where people of all colors, people of all genders, people of all persuasions and backgrounds are now equal when it comes to the law, yet the experience isn't equal, and there's a lot of hurt and pain. So that's what I feel is where we're headed.
So transitional justice, is it always sort of with a capital T, like truth and reconciliation, or is there a more micro version of transitional justice, which is about smaller groups of people or between two people? Or is it always sort of the big iron approach?
No, it's what you said. It's all of the above. It's between two people. It's between families. So there's been transition that's happened between families, right? In the US, there's been examples of families of people who enslaved other people, right? 200 years ago, their descendants coming to have a reconciliation process with the descendants of the people they enslaved, right? Oftentimes they've actually intermixed their family themselves. So that's at the very, very micro level. And then organizations are doing it too. Puma, for example, acknowledging their role in the Holocaust, right? So these companies have taken that public stance, delivering the truth. This is how they did it, and wanting to repair that harm. And it's beginning to happen with, media organizations, with big companies. That's basically the process. But I feel like for a social catharsis within a society, a governmental process is really helpful. But I think within organizations, within families, we're constantly in transition, right?
Yeah, and I want to make a link between, I actually think it's a very challenging thing to do, which is a link between the internal states of people and the state of the system. And so you have a paper which is about I'm going to say it wrong, the Vedana?
Vedana, yeah.
You have a paper about the Vedana of bias. And I need an explanation of Vedana. To me, it sounds a lot like phenomenology. It's what are the internal states? What are the feelings? But let's start off with the definition of that.
So the Vedana of bias. So Vedana is basically the Pali term or the Sanskrit term for the second foundation of mindfulness. So basically the way my approach to addressing bias is very shame-free, and it's rooted in mindfulness and compassion practices because we're really helping people rewire their brains, rewire that software we just talked about through practice. But in order to become familiar with that, we need to first understand what mindfulness is. And in Buddhist psychology, there's four kind of foundations of mindfulness. The first one is the body, to become aware of the body. And the second one is Vedana, which is feeling tone. So it's not really feelings, it's really feeling tone, which basically means that for every experience we have with our senses, we feel either it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. It's just one of those three things. And it's on that spectrum, right? So if we think of asparagus, for some of us, very pleasant, others unpleasant. And some folks, neutral, depends on how it's cooked, right? Same thing with the type of music we listen to. Smells, taste, touch, clothes we wear, all of those things have a Vedana associated with it, a feeling tone associated with it. So now when it comes to bias, and I'll define bias now, bias, the way I define it, there's conscious bias and unconscious bias. Conscious bias is basically learned false beliefs that we accept as true about a human identity that distorts how we perceive, reason, remember, and make decisions. So that's like consciously believing that somehow women are less than men. They're weaker, they're the weaker sex, they're not smart. This is a conscious bias because there's no scientific evidence, or people collect the evidence that supports these kind of flawed ideas, but it's a conscious bias. It's a belief, but it's a false belief. Now, most of us actually don't have these conscious bias. We believe all people are equal, regardless of their color, their gender identity. But we have these unconscious biases, which is learned habits of thoughts that distorts how we perceive, reason, remember, and make decisions. So now these are habits of thoughts. And how do we learn them? Through our social surroundings, right? Through our education, through the media, through our families, through our loved ones, through people we trust. And this is what aggravates unconscious bias. So for example, no doctor, at least in my opinion, would wake up in the morning wanting to create more injustice in the world or more inequity in the world. Yet we know from scientific studies that people with darker skin routinely receive lower doses of pain medication because there is an association between dark skin and pain threshold, including darker skin doctors. Not all, but some, right? To a different degree. What's going on there? This is the nature of implicit bias, those associations that have been learned. So Vedana is really what's helping us understand the strength of those associations. It's positive or negative. So it's the software. So the opportunity for me is really, oh, wow, if we can understand this concept. This is what's known as the implicit association test that was invented at Harvard. So they're really testing the same idea of pleasant and pleasant and being able to show measurably the strength of those associations. So for me, it's like, okay, we can understand this now, but then how do we change it? And that's really the exciting work of innovating around this challenge is because we've been talking about doing something about it, but then what we really need is to train people in behavior change, in unlearning and relearning.
What is that study at Harvard?
It's an instrument. It's called the Implicit Association Test, or the IAT. And basically the way it works is that they have over 20 identities, whether it's the gender test or the race test or the ability test, immigration test. What they do is they flash a bunch of images on a screen and a bunch of words that are positive or negative. And we have to, as a recipient, what we're doing is we're hitting E and I as quickly as possible. So it's an association test. And then on the back end, the instrument is measuring at the microsecond level, how many errors you're making, and basically your response latency to these associations. And that's when we know that it's easier, for example, for people to make positive associations with white skin and negative associations with dark skin. It's easier for people to associate being out in the world working with names or faces that are male versus kind of more of the homebound with female. And the interesting thing with implicit bias is that it's not just affecting people who are in the dominant identity, but also subordinated identities. So someone like a Gloria Steinem can take the gender IAT, and it's revealed that, oh, she too has these implicit associations between gender identity and the home. like female and home and male and work. It's just like, oh, wow, it's the training, it's the software.
One of the things I worry about with a lot of this work is that it can be very American. In other words, it's just, at least in the conversations I'm hearing, it's highly American. How does this show up globally? Because I believe, I suspect anyway, that there are categories of bias that I simply can't interpret, I can't perceive in other cultures.
So it's very society dependent. You're absolutely right. And for you, if you go into a society that you're not familiar with, it's just going to be like your brain, if you think about the software, doesn't know how to interpret it. So it'll most likely be neutral, or it'll go into a defense or fear mode of the unknown. But I'll give you a few examples. So I worked in Malaysia for a summer, and Malaysia is, I would say, a mid-income country and has its own racial challenges, right? So the dominant race there is people that are Malays who are legally defined as Muslim. And then there's a sizable Chinese ethnic minority and a sizable Indian ethnic minority. And these same challenges that we see in the US or Australia or Canada kind of show up there, but they're different because the historical context is different. But that bias element, those learned habits of thoughts between who is Muslim, who isn't Muslim, who is Chinese, who isn't Chinese, who people are going to relate to. And they show up in similar ways, analogous ways, because that training is the same. And it shows up in countries like Lebanon. Everyone looks the same, but there's three major religions. You're either Christian, you're Sunni Muslim, or Shia Muslim. And there's a legal apparatus that's defined who is what, who is superior, who is inferior, who gets to be president, who gets to be prime minister. And people can't see the difference, mostly. But the second they know someone's name, they'll know the difference. So those implicit associations get triggered right away. Very similar, like my country of birth is India, right? So there, despite caste is a really big problem there, but it's not connected to people's physical appearance. So again, in the West, sometimes we overlay our understanding of race onto caste, but that's not true. There are people that are very light-skinned who are part of the untouchable caste, and people that are very dark-skinned that are Brahmins, right, who are the top caste. But the way people just understand, once again, how they know one to be of a caste is the way people walk, the way people talk, their accents, their name, or simply, as they do in Northern Ireland, ask people, hey, are you Catholic or Protestant? It's a similar process. The groups are different, the in-group and the out-group. The tribes are different. The labels are different associated with them, but the way our brains have been trained to kind of respond to them is very similar.
I also think sometimes there's some deliberate signaling, which is I'm going to wear clothes that signal my group. And I'm doing that because I want to be part of my group. It can set up those boundaries. I was very impressed so I spent 6 weeks in India on a project. And what's interesting is that new bias that you haven't experienced your whole life in a society, is much more noticeable than one that you've just grown completely accustomed to. I noticed this in Ukraine too, which is that I stopped at an island in the Dnieper River, and I had very rarely seen blonde poverty. To see blonde poverty I realized how much I had been neglecting dark-haired poverty. And it completely rearranged my understanding of my own implicit biases. In India, I had a driver, and I was so impressed by how some members of society thought that they could ask my driver to go get them a pack of cigarettes. I don't know if that was a class difference or what it was, but I could see it in ways that I couldn't see it in my own culture.
Yeah, it's so powerful what you shared, right? This idea of blonde poverty. It's everywhere in the US. Go to Appalachia, go to the South, go to Texas, go to Nebraska, go to Idaho, North Dakota. The median income, the average income is under $30,000, $40,000 of people who are white. And our media doesn't portray poverty that way. So in our media, in our books, in the news, poverty is portrayed as something that people of color have, Black people have, brown people have, Mexicans have, when the vast majority of the poor are actually white in our country, any Western country. Now that creates a perception. in our own minds and in the minds of those individuals themselves around who is poor, who isn't poor, who is needy, who isn't needy. And then it begins to trickle into these stories around people misusing the system, people becoming wealthier, these stereotypes that are being created, and people then act against their own interests. This kind of reminds me of when the war in the Ukraine started. There was a journalist at the BBC or another British newscast who was very, very moved by the horrific things that were happening in the Ukraine. And he went on to say something like, well, you expect this in other countries, but this is like blonde hair, blue eyed people that this is happening to. These are people like me. So what he was exhibiting at the time was empathy. He was exhibiting empathy that, wow, this could happen to me. But because of that training, those learned habits of thoughts, of implicit bias, he was unable to, basically display that type of empathy when this happens in Somalia, when this happens in Syria, when this happens in Iraq and Afghanistan. Because again, there is that othering, that common humanity isn't there.
Yeah. I really actually felt a lot of sympathy for that reporter because I know how easy it was to step into that. I suspect that reporter was to some extent trying to create empathy and compassion in their readership. And so a part of it was saying, look, these are readership. These are people who look like you. I understand the mistake, but I've heard a lot about it since then. And I'll bet that person, that reporter's really, really living with that decision.
Yeah, he's apologized. I think totally understandable, but part of the challenge is that when something like that happens to darker skinned people, that level of empathy isn't displayed, right?
Yes.
This actually, again, it's something that's studied. It's called the racial empathy gap. So actually scientists in Italy, what they did was they had a whole host of participants watch videos of a needle piercing a hand. And some of the hands were dark skinned, others were lighter skinned. And they could begin to measure, through sweat glands, through a whole host of other indicators, who was displaying empathy. And we saw that it's easier to elicit empathy for people with lighter skin than dark skin. And this, again, is the software. And this is kind of the basis for how we build our society and bias and how it then leads to the experiences of human beings who are suffering, that are in pain. So that's where I feel like this, as you said, when we started our conversation, it's like, this is the root of it, right? That difference, that otherness, the empathy gap. And this is also the opportunity for our century.
So bias is one of the root causes of systemic racism. And I want to go through some more of them before we get more deeply into bias. What are the root causes of systemic racism?
Yeah. So there are different types of biases, right? There's gender bias, there's sexual orientation bias, religious bias. But when it comes to racial bias and racism in general, in the US, we talk about this idea of systemic racism, right? This is very American, might also be Canadian, any place that's been settled by Europeans. But in our culture, it's pretty pervasive now. And for me, I came to a study after law school where whenever we were talking about this idea of systemic racism, we were using the word racism to define systemic racism. You're like, how do you define racism? And then basically, if you ask 10 people, they have 10 different definitions. Some people talk about it interpersonally, some people talk about institution. I was like, oh my gosh, this is a hot mess. So as a young attorney, I was working at a think tank. So I got permission to undertake a study that would just define systemic racism in a way that my 10-year-old niece can understand without using the word racism. So we did this research where, I come from an international development background. So I'm very familiar with kind of the human development indices that are kind of collected across the world. And I was like, okay, can we break down this problem into disparities? Social, economic, political, cultural disparities, big ideas, big conventions. And we broke that down further. So when we talk about economic disparities, we're talking about employment rates, the wealth gap. We're talking about social disparities, education, healthcare. We're talking about political disparities, political representation within local and state governments. What are those disparities? So literally, we went to 8 different disciplines, media representation, and just collected numbers around disparities between people that are assigned different races. white people and Black people, and where we could collect for Asian Americans and Latinx people and Indigenous people, we did. But the research, again, has a bias where it's constantly just comparing white and Black folks, which is what another challenge is for a lot of us who are neither white or Black in our country, that, hey, we also exist, that we're a quarter of the country. But again, this is the bias built into research academia itself. And it's beginning to change slightly, but not that much. So when we began to collect the numbers are clear. There's massive disparities across the board. Of course, Black Americans have like 10 times less wealth than white Americans. Median income is low, employment rates, you name it. But then we went to the research that tried to explain what the causes of these disparities are in education, in healthcare. And what we did was we then culled that together and used this idea of root cause analysis, which I think you might be really familiar with. It's very common in engineering. Again, same mindset. It's like, okay, let's apply root cause analysis and begin to understand what are the root causes? What are the overlaps across these industries? And we found 4 root causes of these, what we call systemic racism, of these disparities across the board. First is lack of resources or access to resources in communities of color. So what does that mean? It's anything from as simple as public transportation to safe green parks to supermarkets. They're just absent in communities of color, where they live, where they work. So oftentimes they have to travel an hour or 2 hours to get to work. They don't have any supermarkets. That's why there's this idea of food deserts, transportation deserts. So while there's lack of basic resources in these communities, there's also presence of traumatic environmental factors. So trauma is anything that's life-threatening or emotionally overwhelming. That's where toxic waste sites are placed. That's where landfills are. That's where incinerators are. That's where payday lenders are. That's where lots of fast food stores are. So just as our bodies require nourishment, these communities don't have those nourishing things. And on top of that, they have these traumatic things that further create disparities when it comes to their health, when it comes to education.
My daughter worked as a teacher for the last 4 years in South Central Los Angeles. And what she found was that there was a lot of trauma around COVID, and there was a lot of death related to COVID, but it was equaled by gun violence.
Yeah. Presence of guns.
As many of her students were affected by deaths in their family or in their social circles through gun violence as COVID.
Yeah, I lived in East Harlem in New York after law school for a few years. And I remember coming out of the train sometimes on Fifth Avenue, right? It's just 5 blocks away from Upper East Side, which is the wealthiest neighborhood in New York City. And there are just cameras everywhere. There's police presence everywhere. And there are just young Black and brown children that are constantly playing under surveillance. Again, the police trying to arrest these young people, possibly for marijuana possession, which has now become such a lucrative industry for so many people. And then again, ruining not just those individual lives, the lives of their families. So that cycle of trauma perpetuates itself, which goes to the third root cause, which is institutional policies. So the policies are racially neutral. No one says that you have to go stop Black drivers when they're speeding, but the way they're enforced is not racially neutral across the board, from ADHD assessments for young kids to, again, stop and frisk policies across cities. And we're seeing some of the ramifications of that since the advent of phone cameras, right? It's been happening for 50, 60 years, but we just didn't know about it because we didn't have these little devices that can capture it. That goes to the fourth cause, which is bias. Implicit bias and explicit bias, conscious and unconscious bias. And for me, this is what creates what we call systemic racism: lack of resources, presence of trauma, institutional policies, and bias. And I was like super excited after we did this research in 2012. I spoke to folks at Princeton, at Columbia. I'm like, let's publish this. Let's bring this to the world. And academia at the time, perhaps still now, was so siloed. They were like, oh, this is great, but we just want to talk about criminal justice. We just want to talk about education, just healthcare, just employment. I just do this little thing. It wasn't systems thinking at all. It wasn't like, oh, hey, this is a problem across the board. This is a problem in technology. This is a problem, and let's do something about it. It's like, no, let's just talk this. I was like, no, we can't do that. Thankfully, the organization I worked with then licensed this research to me, and we started this organization, Be More, wanting to do something about it. Initially, just to publish this research. But then when I was talking to stakeholders in communities, from indigenous communities to Black communities to communities that work on racial justice and white communities, they were like, we already know this. We live this day in and day out. We need solutions. That's where the idea for breaking bias really came out, because I can't change how resources are allocated or not allocated in entire communities across the country. But what I can do is train people in breaking bias. And that is really the beginning of addressing the other three causes. Because as we break individual biases, these are the individuals who are making decisions or asking for decisions from their local, state, and federal lawmakers, from their own organizations. That, hey, we need to change these policies so they can be more equitable and less biased. So I feel like that's kind of my journey into this. And I find that it's probably very similar if we did a similar root cause analysis in France, let's say, between the experiences of the white French and French people of color, Moroccan, Algerian descent, or in Germany, the disparities between Turkish immigrants and the Germans, or in Canada between Indigenous people and other Canadians. So, but I don't know. I haven't done that research. I've only done it in the US.
That's actually, though, that's part of the reason why I brought up the global question, is I brought it up because I think that there's a very generalizable set of problems potentially underlying those, and a very generalizable set of interventions. And so I'd like to talk about what some of those interventions are, because to me, I can manage my behavior around conscious bias.
Exactly.
I have conscious biases, and I can manage my behavior there. But to me, unconscious bias is sort of like, it's like trying to lift my eyebrow when I can't lift my left eyebrow. Like, I don't even know how to start. And so, is it possible to make an intervention on something that is unconscious?
Well, the first thing is, I'm going to talk about it's basically the PRISM toolkit, which is why it's so exciting. The science, the neuroscience of neuroplasticity, the science around human behavior and behavior change, all that exciting innovation that's happening hasn't been applied to this area. So for me, that's what we're doing with the PRISM toolkit. And I'll go into PRISM. PRISM is an acronym for 5 tools that have each shown to not just measurably reduce bias, but also enhance one's well-being. But before I do that, I want to talk about the 3 aspects of a workplace or of an organization where bias comes up. First is really service delivery. It's really important, right? So if you're a teacher, if you're a doctor, if you're a lawyer, if you're a therapist, if you're an engineer, if you're a retail person, right? The second is product development. So this is really, really, really important, right? I had a professor at Cambridge when I was a student there. He was an economist. His famous, I don't know if he coined it, but he used to say garbage in, garbage out when it came to data. And for me, when we design these algorithms are just as good as the people that are designing them. So that we're coding our biases within these algorithms. And the prime example for product design around algorithms was the credit card that came out last year. It was an Apple and Goldman Sachs collaboration that basically gave women less credit than men. There was an executive at Apple or Goldman Sachs, I can't remember. He and his wife make the same amount of money because they file their taxes together. And his wife applied for that credit card and got credit that's 10 times less than him. How did that happen? Because of the people, right? Similarly, product design of something as simple as t-shirts. Gucci has gotten in trouble. H&M, again, implicit bias, end to end. And the third, of course, is what we're most familiar with, which is the workplace. Recruitment, retention, advancement, compensation, conflict management, discrimination in the workplace. That's where DEI, the industry, is really focused on the workplace, but I think we're missing out on the service delivery and the product development side. So with that said, going to your question about how do we do it? How do we address bias? Well, the way to really break bias is becoming aware of these stereotypes, these learned habits, and then begin to transform them. And the way to do that is these 5 tools called PRISM: perspective taking, pro-social behavior, individuation, stereotype replacement, and mindfulness. And for me, mindfulness is really the bedrock and the foundation for all 5 of these tools, because it helps us become aware of what our associations are. So when I think of a leader, who do I think of? Is it a man? Is it a woman? Is it a trans person? What's their height? What's their age? And again, no shame in the game. That's so important. It's not about, oh my gosh, I can only think of white man when it comes to a leader. No, that's okay. Those are the learned habits of thoughts. But that's why we start with mindfulness and then begin to build up the stereotype replacement. Can you think of Oprah? Can you think of Malala Yousafzai? And really actively insert that, stereotype replacement. So we're basically expanding the repertoire of our association and then moving to individuation, which is about curiosity, which is really about, I am with Dart. So yes, Dart wears glasses. He's like a silver fox. And I have all sorts of associations around that. But it's like, okay, but I'm going to be with Dart. I'm going to notice the associations, but I actually don't know. Right? I didn't know you were a criminal investigator. I didn't know you lived in India. I didn't know you went into the Ukraine. Amazing, right? The more curious I can be, the more I get to also marvel at the curiosity of my colleagues. And then that allows us to the curiosity then bridges to the last two of these interventions, which is perspective taking and pro-social behaviors, which is, active cultivation of empathy and compassion. And this is really the application of the research done at Stanford Medical School's Center for Compassion and Altruism on how these skills of empathy and compassion are muscles that we can build. They not only address bias, but they basically address a lot of the mental health challenges, the well-being challenges we're facing within our economy, within our communities, and of course in our organizations. So that's kind of a quick survey of this work.
I have come across this in a couple of other interviews that mindfulness and design it's almost like mindfulness is one of a core competency of design. And to some extent, it's in product design, right? What you were talking about. But I see managers as designers of work experience for the people on their team. And so the ability to, A, be clear enough in one's own emotional state to be able to be empathetic with members of your team and see them clearly and understand them clearly. And also the ability to listen closely and work on individuation with members of your team.
Yeah.
It's a design activity.
It is, absolutely. And the wonderful thing about the research around this is now we don't have to do this on our own. So like that leadership model of a singular leader, we can actually, manage up and manage down as well and really include others in that design process as coming together. Because part of it is that all of us have certain blind spots or conscious and unconscious associations, but we can begin to resolve them through communication, through teamwork.
It's interesting because as you talk, I'm starting to see a stack, which is that there's the root causes of systemic bias. But when I look at those systemic racism, when I look at those, they share among them a common cause of bias.
Exactly.
And then if I look at bias and I look across the root causes of bias and I look at that, underneath that is a common root cause of lack of mindfulness. And I don't know if that's the most fundamental here. I don't understand the word pro-social behavior. And there's a book, Pro-Social, which I have not had the time to read. So can you say what that is?
Yes. It's exactly what the word is. It's pro-social as opposed to anti-social. So a lot of times when we think about folks that, have mental health challenges, we call them antisocial. So pro-social are basically a group of skills, a toolkit of skills that can be cultivated that make one pro-social, make one feel more connected to themselves and other people. And these include empathy, compassion, but also things like gratitude, generosity, joy, equanimity. And again, these are mind states. So the social science and neuroscience around this is really strong because we can begin to measure where they operate in our brain. For empathy and compassion, for example, it's really the frontal lobe, this part of our brain. And through daily practice of these PRISM tools, and the science has been up to 8 weeks of daily practice, 15 minutes a day, we can really shift the structure of our brain in that time and the size of this place in our brain that is able to plan and respond So again, it's about really shifting our nervous system from being in a place of fight flight all the time, from in a place of reacting to responding.
One of the most important things you said in there was 8 weeks, because it seems to me that there's a risk with the idea that we have to dig pretty deep into our subconscious that it's sort of like, I'm never going to get there.
Yeah. Because for me, like this work, I never set out to do this work around DEIB. And for me, I was like, oh my God, this is just like lifelong. It's like treacherous and so burdensome. But then the science around it's like, oh, it's really 8 weeks of daily practice to build a new habit. So we're really building a new habit, a new muscle. And as we build this muscle, we begin to feel better about ourselves and more comfortable with other people. So even when we make mistakes, we're like, oh, okay, I'm sorry. How would you have done it? Like I do that all the time. And sometimes when I'm doing it, when someone is calling me out and I have a challenge with calling out, but that's okay. It doesn't affect me as much when I am getting called out. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry I hurt you. So how would you have done it? So really like put it back on them. And sometimes the person is just like, oh, I actually don't know, but that's not right. It's like, okay, well, great. I acknowledge that's not right, but now let's come up with a way to think about what is right, what is more appropriate in that situation.
What's the relationship between bias and belonging? Because both of these terms are circulating and they seem to run in an orbit around each other, but they're not the same thing.
Yeah, they're not. So I'm going to throw in another word, which is known as common enemy intimacy. This was really termed by one of my favorite scholars, Brene Brown. So belonging is really basic. The way I define it is really being able to express and celebrate one's human diversity without posing any threat or danger to oneself. So that second portion is really important. It's not just expressing and celebrating a diversity. So let's say a trans woman coming out and really celebrating herself as who she is, but also posing no threat or danger to herself in doing so. And that's what we're trying to do. Create organizations, companies where people can belong, where they can be their full selves without feeling like they're under threat. They're going to feel marginalized or excluded or even harmed, right? So that's what belonging is. And bias is the block to get to belonging, conscious bias and unconscious bias. So when it comes to transphobia, it's really believing that they're somehow wrong, like their existence is wrong for trans people. And when it comes to unconscious bias, those learned habits of thoughts that distorts how we perceive another human being. So bias is kind of the roadblock to belonging.
Yeah. And so whenever I think about the design of work experience, I'm always trying to ask myself, what is the material that I am designing in? In other words, am I designing in policy? Am I designing in, the space of the building? Where am I building it? When I swing the hammer, what am I hitting? And so where I'm arriving at here is that a huge part of designing the experience of work is the material that I'm working on is the same material that mindfulness works on. So it's whatever mindfulness works on is the material of design of the experience of work in this case.
Yeah, exactly. It's really true. And I feel that when it comes to design and, using design to create belonging, it requires a lot of mindfulness, particularly mindfulness of diversity of human expression and the fullness of human experience.
You've also studied L3C companies and B Corps.
Yes, I have. My company is a B Corp. We're a registered B Corp.
Okay, great. I'd like to learn more about that. And it's partially because some of the material that you design in when you're designing an experience of work is business model.
Yeah.
What's the difference between L3Cs and B Corps and other corporations? And how's it going in terms of getting those to be successful?
So I did an academic study. So I was basically, before I started my company, I was in the market to become a legal academic. And so that'd be surprising. I really love corporate structures and corporate law just because it's just so intellectually stimulating and it just makes sense, right? The way it's designed. And for me, this was 12 years ago, there was these two innovative legal structures that were coming around, L3Cs and B Corps. L3Cs stand for low profit limited liability companies, and B Corps is known as benefit corporations. And the idea for both of these entities, and there are others that have come around in other different states, the idea was really to build a corporate structure, a business structure that doesn't exclusively is beholden to shareholder value. So this comes again from the law where, in corporate law, there have been companies that they've like sued their board of directors, sued their C-suite management for compromising shareholder value, the bottom line, for social, political, environmental reasons. So these entities were part of that movement where it was like, hey, no, we need to care about all stakeholders. It's not just about shareholders. So L3Cs are basically, they're similar to nonprofits. So nonprofits are basically a legal entity which has tax exemption for doing charitable work. So L3Cs are not charitable because they're allowed to make profit. They define what that means, what profit they make, and how low profit is actually calculated. But they really exist for a social purpose as a company. Now, do they have any other additional benefits to L3Cs? I may be wrong here, and maybe your listeners can correct me. But I find that L3Cs really take it on to themselves what they're going to do and what they're not going to do. And I think they exist in several states like Vermont and Illinois and other places. So it's an interesting model. Benefit corporations, on the other hand, actually have become quite successful because it's become a global movement, not just across various states where one can become a public benefit corporation, like Ben & Jerry's, like Patagonia, like huge brands that we know, but also smaller businesses like myself. And benefit corporations are really organizations that have taken on a business mission, like products and services, that basically holds to the triple bottom line: people, planet, and profits simultaneously, right? Or some people say people and planet before profits. So this is really kind of coming out of the environmental and sustainability movement in particular. And in the last 5 years has really taken on labor rights and diversity, equity, and inclusion as well. And that's what's really exciting for me because it's really about making business work for everyone and really using business as a lever for social change and alleviation of suffering. So the way benefit corporations work is that they have to basically get certified or audited by a third party in order to be registered with the state or the country they're in as a benefit corporation. So there are various certification agencies, but the most popular of them is known as B Lab, which is a nonprofit based out of Pennsylvania that really started this movement. And what they've done is they've really created rigorous standards, very rigorous standards around workplace, around sustainability measures, around policies and practices, around revenue share and other things. And basically you have to meet a certain threshold in order to be certified as a B Lab company. And then you can submit that to the state you're in or the country you're in to then be registered as a benefit corporation. And then you basically get to be a part of a community of other business leaders, other entrepreneurs who share this vision for really using business as a lever to create a more equitable society and economy.
Are B Corps publicly held? Do they have IPOs and sell stock?
Yeah, there's several. So Delaware is the first state to actually allow public benefit corporations. So I believe Patagonia is one of those companies. There's quite a few now.
And it seems to me like it would be very hard for an established company to actually transition from a traditional for-profit into a B Corp.
You'd be surprised how easy it is actually, because I find, having talked to many, many entrepreneurs, and because I work with companies and organizations, that a lot of companies are already doing it. They just don't know it. So when they go through the certification process, when they go through the metrics, they're like, oh, wow, we actually are doing really good for the world. So yeah, but I think for large companies, it might be tough. But also it's an opportunity to really put their money where their mouth is right? So it's not just a marketing campaign, but actually we're building a world and economy for 7 generations forward, at a time of hyperpolarization, of climate change, and so many other challenges that we face as a global community.
The fundamental argument behind a lot of my work is that we have formulated our business models wrong. And in particular, that our biggest mistake is that we have framed the workforce as an input to production, as opposed to what I think they are literally by definition, which is customers. And so when I frame it that way, what I'm talking about is I'm saying that just means that all companies are multi-sided and that they are serving a multi-sided business model. And so we already have a lot of examples of models of multi-sided business models: ad-based media, savings and loans, Uber, Airbnb. These are all business models that have these two sides. And so B Corps start to look like that becomes a formal structure. I don't really know how to fit Planet into that model that I just described, but it at least takes care of the employee side.
And the coolest thing there is that I really find that it's the future of business as a whole, because since I wrote that paper in 2011, so it's been 11 years, the number of B Corps across the world have, I don't know, 100x'd. So more and more companies are actually voluntarily joining this movement because they feel an obligation. And also they feel like they're with other people and other businesses that share their values. And to your point around the planet piece, actually, this is where economists come in. Like there's so many amazing economists that have actually created pretty detailed models on how to value the environment and how that could be placed within our business models. So we're not working against our environment. We're not working against the planet, but we're working with the planet.
So, as somebody who's dedicated to changing large systems, what advice do you have for people who are attempting to lead similar changes?
Oh, that's such a wonderful question, Dart. You have a way of really crafting these questions that really get to kind of the root of a lot of these challenges. First of all, I would like to encourage them to continue to think this way because, a lot of the challenges, as we've discussed, that we face in our world today are systemic. So my advice would really be to kind of take it a bit higher and higher and higher. So like oftentimes you get stuck in the trees of a forest without seeing the big picture. And the way I came to address these larger challenges around conscious and unconscious biases within systems, within organizations, was actually something that a lot of businesses do already, a lot of systems do already, which is the root cause analysis. Anything from workplace conflict issues to product development. What is the root cause of these challenges? And that really helps us begin to really list out and really distill to minutiae. Well, these are all the little things, but can I bucket them so we can have these bigger frameworks? And I talked about the root cause analysis. We were able to say like, oh, this is what's going on in our society, in our world. And it really helped then create clarity around, well, if this is it, well, then we can now innovate. We can create solutions to address these broader challenges. But in order to do this, I think there are some other qualitative qualities that one really has to practice, which is one of patience and also trying to be as objective as possible. And that's really difficult because we're so invested. We're so craving change and transformation. For me, like, this is my training as a scientist. Like, can I bring that objective inquiry? So not let my desires for a certain result really cloud my judgment as I really move into this investigation. So I'll stop there.
No, I mean, there's three things there that I heard. One of them is find the root cause.
Yeah.
Don't treat the symptoms and go after the root cause if you can. The second thing I heard is be patient. But I'll tell you, I learned something from one of my managers, Terry Clark, who's a fabulous manager. She was able to see incremental wins on the way to the big win. And when you're working on large systems, we were a change management team, and so we were trying to transform how a company ran. And so she was able to see incremental wins and celebrate them. To me, without her help, they were invisible because all I was after was the big change. That may take a long, long time.
Yeah.
Do you see incremental wins?
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about, because I look at time as deep time, so I'm a big fan of, looking at human history from like a distance. And in terms of the last 100 years, last 50 years, last 20 years, last 10 years, 5 years, 3 months, right? There is a shift in human evolution. There's a shift in consciousness that has taken place in terms of how we treat ourselves, how we treat one another, our expectations around workplaces and what work is supposed to be. Like the fact that you're coming, we're here talking about work and what work means. This is already a shift, right? It's a shift, and part of the opportunity of this moment is to utilize all these mechanisms and mediums that, as humans we've invented and created to connect one another, to now make them more effective, make them more efficient, particularly towards the ends that we all share, which is to alleviate suffering, to make our lives more comfortable and our lives and the way we operate our systems more sustainable, whether it's cost effectiveness or just at the end of the day, more ease and peace. And that's what's really important. And I feel like sometimes and I've done this myself, so I'm like the first person who's guilty of this, when we're kind of stuck in these frameworks and these methodological processes, we get lost in the nitty gritties and forget that, oh, wait, we're doing this for this larger purpose. And then in that moment, I think what your manager does, celebrating those wins, really helps, really, really helps. And I think that's so wise.
Yeah. And also realizing that change comes in like the tide. And what I mean by that is the wave comes up the beach and you think we've done it. And then the wave recedes.
Yeah.
And you're like, this is not working. But then the net wave comes in and it goes a little higher.
Yeah.
And so if you just watch the waves, you can not see the tide.
Yeah.
And then your third point, which was to be objective. I think it's hard when you care so much about something to do that. But it's super important. So closing questions, just a couple of questions. I always ask this question. And by the way, some people have said, do you have to ask that question at the end of the podcast and then I leave it off? And then I get lots of people who call up and say, why didn't you ask that question?
Yeah.
Which is, what job do you hire your job to do for you?
Well, I think the first job that I hire myself to do for me is to build a vision, right? To build a vision around a challenge that's important to pretty much every corporate executive, every engineer, every doctor that I meet, issues of equity and belonging, but approach it from a place of compassion and understanding. And I think for me, this is difficult because this is last to that third point. I can sometimes get caught, well, it should be this way. And, I have this fist and I'm like, wait, the fact that a lot of companies have committed $67 billion annually to this challenge. So this is not a small feat. So the intention is there, the commitment is there, and now even the resources are there. So that helps me really remind myself that, okay, well, then I have to address the pain points. What are the pain points? And I think that's so important for me to do that with myself and my team as well. And the second thing is really lead by example. So all the things that I teach and train and bring to companies and organizations, I have to do that myself. I have to make sure that my company follows a similar logic, because I just think that's really important to stay consistent and to then build a network, build communities of professionals and organizations that feel like this isn't just some theoretical idea that's being proposed, but something that's working. And similarly, so that's like walk the talk, right? And the third is kind of this idea of, in everything I do, really, I've really embraced this, particularly in the climate that we're living in, this idea of do no harm. And sometimes that's not possible, because this is the nature of unconscious bias. We've talked about this for the last hour. But I feel like that intention is still really important, because in instances where I become conscious of how I may have caused harm, it allows me to then approach that with humility.
That's interesting. you've answered it in a way that I've never quite heard. And recently I interviewed Shalini Verma, and she might have answered this question the same way you just did, which is, I hire my job to be better, which is funny. That's the name of your website, right?
Yeah, be more.
Oh, it's Be More. It's not Be Better, but it's Be More with Anu. And so, but this idea that there's an aspect of self growth in what you hire your job to do for you. And a way to think about that is it can be a forge for self betterment. It can be an exercise room for self betterment, but that there's something there about being the change.
Yeah. It's so funny you mentioned that because, I remember in college, this was a long time ago, and, that phrase, be the change you wish to see in the world, like that phrase was just like percolating everywhere. It's still around, but it's like one of those like platitudes that we just share with one another. But just as you said, it reminded me of that moment, kind of standing outside speaking to a friend. And for me, it's really about being that change. It's not like asking others to do it. Yeah, that could be part of it. It's not forcing others to do it or bringing other people along, but be it. Just like be it, embrace it, and then stop.
Well, and I always thought about that phrase, be the change, which was like, set a good example. Start with you. It was sort of like that. But actually, it's different from that, the way you just said it, which is that there's a reward, a personal reward to being that change that is independent from whether or not you're setting an example. And so I think that's really powerful. I think that's super, super powerful. And it ties back a little bit to an interview I had with Don Norman, the person who wrote The Design of Everyday Things. And he was talking about how designers need to be a part of sustainability and creating what he calls humanity-centered design. So every designer can be the thing that they're trying to create. So it's a super interesting answer. And what does your job cost you?
That's so interesting. What does my job cost me? That's an interesting way of phrasing the way I would hear it, because I think it costs me the status quo. It costs me kind of staying, kind of just staying at the usual pace of things, because my job really costs me to move forward. It like not just it almost forces me day in and day out to like advance, to grow, to be more. And so it costs me certainty. It costs me predictability for sure. That's like the biggest thing, because every day there's something new. And I think it also costs me my own, I guess it costs me my ignorance. This is so interesting, the way I'm understanding and perceiving your answer, because I feel that it's the way I approach it. Every day I'm learning something new, being with other people, and my own weak points, the ways I oversee things. Like I'll give you an example. The word blind spot. It's something that is so common in our daily language. And a few months ago, a colleague approached me and she was like, that term is really ableist. And I was like, what? And in the first moment, I was like defensive. And then I was like, oh my gosh, it is, right? Like basically, we're saying that people who are blind, there's something wrong with them. And then we use this language day in and day out, not intentionally. That's the thing. It's not, but it's just it. So it costs me my ignorance, like the stability and safety.
That goes very well with what you said before, which is that if a part of what you hire your job to do is to be the thing, well, it's not easy to be the thing. And so the cost is also becoming the thing, right? The cost of becoming that thing. And is there an emotional labor cost to what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a love-hate relationship with this phrase, emotional labor, because I feel like as human beings, that's what we have. That's what makes us human, right? Yes, we have rationale and logic. We also have a right brain. We're a feeling, creative being. And that landscape of feelings and emotions differs from person to person. So I feel like this phrase has kind of caught on as a way to, again, cancel and reproach other challenging things within organizations. But I really think that for me, like when my colleague who came up to me and shared that with me, I was like, oh yeah, there was like a moment of like, oh my God, I'm wrong, or I did something wrong. But I could feel it. And then suddenly compassion can enter. It's like, oh my gosh, thank you for sharing this with me, first of all, because I've been going around the world giving speeches and talks and trainings using this thing and possibly causing a lot of harm. And then secondly, it's like, oh, I need to feel it because that feeling that I felt is probably how others feel it. So it actually brings me closer. Yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of this term. Sorry. We'll have to have another conversation around that.
No, that's it's a good point. And I'll tell you why I brought it up, which is that you told a story when we spoke before of being on stage and asking for anonymous questions or anonymous topics that people could ask you. And you'd get these notes. And these notes were people, because it was anonymous, people were talking about things that they wouldn't otherwise talk about. And you had to absorb the knowledge of whatever they were telling you. And that was a burden. That's what I was using the word emotional labor about, is just this idea that to be compassionate for others is hard.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it, and I learned a lot. How could others learn more about what you do?
Yes. So folks can go to Be More with Anu, BEMORE, BeMoreWithAnu.com. Find us on all the social channels, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and really share with us how this conversation felt for you, what questions you still have. Really engage with us. We're really building a new movement, really kind of transforming the way DEIB is understood in the world, and also how we practice what we call the PRISM Toolkit, these mindfulness-based tools to really advance action forward. You know, one of my favorite authors, Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote *Sapiens*, really says, you know, meditation is one of the 21 things we need in the 21st century, you know, as with the advent of technology and AI. And I really feel that that is how we're going to keep what keeps us human present in this century. So please continue to stay in touch. We also have our first Breaking Bias Summit, applying mindfulness to dismantle systemic racism. That's coming up on November 3rd and 4th. So we're going to have another one next year. So do check it out. The recordings will still be up. It's going to be a really incredible event with, you know, leading meditation teacher Sharon Salzberg, the chief equity officer of the American Medical Association, and like over 8 workshops with kind of leading thinkers and advocates and scholars from across industries who are really trying to innovate around this challenge that feels sometimes very, very overwhelming. This is why the opportunity is now for us to really come together. So I hope you'll just stay in touch.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.